Welcome back to our study of 1 Samuel. This is session 7, and we're talking about 1 Samuel chapters 9 through 13. We're talking in this one about Israel's first king, who we will come to know as a man named Saul. Now, we are coming hot off the heels of, I think, one of the important turning points in the Old Testament story, 1 Samuel 8, when the people of Israel essentially rejected God as their sole king, and they said that we want a king like all the other nations to lead us, and we want it right now. We're not going to wait for God's kind of king. We want this kind of king, and we want it now. And that story ends with a little bit of anticlimax when Samuel the prophet hears the response of the people and their persistence in wanting a king and says, okay, fine, everybody go home. And it's sort of like from a narrative vantage point, where are we going to go next? We know that something is going to happen, but what is it going to look like? Chapters 9 through 13 answer that question. And this, again, really is the sort of rise and unfortunately quick fall of Israel's first king, Saul. In some ways, there's a lot that goes on in this section, and it's one of those where we're going to be paraphrasing quite a bit of content because we've got so much to cover. But I want to give you a brief overview. I mean, in some ways, there's sort of like, Samuel is crowned king, so we'll give him a nice fancy crown here with some jewels on it. And then he experiences some initial victory, and then he disobeys and is rejected by God. So like in general terms, that's what happens. But let's break it down in a little bit more detail and look really at the main 6 events that take place in this particular section of Scripture. One of the things that I want you to notice, of course, we're not going to look at all the details, though we'll look at some. One of the things that I want you to notice in our teaching, and also as you read it later, is there's a real ambiguous sense early on about who will Saul become. We really don't know. Is he going to confirm our wildest hopes or our deepest fears? And as the narrative emerges, we'll see that's a complicated question. We'll just give some keywords to each of the scenes that are happening here. We'll go with donkeys for the first one because it actually is chapter 9 specifically about Saul searching for his father's lost donkeys. That's when we first meet him. So Saul is this fascinating character who is a head taller than everyone else, and he's very handsome, and he's out searching for the donkeys of his father Kish that are lost. Now, even right here, we wonder, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? And it's kind of hard to say because on the one hand, negatively, you lost donkeys. Like, it's not good to lose animals. And in particular, oftentimes shepherding was a metaphor for ruling, for being the king or the leader of the people. And so a bad shepherd is a bad king. And so maybe this is a bit foreboding. Maybe the fact that he's lost these donkeys is not a good thing for us. And yet at the same time, you have the physical description of Saul as being a head taller than all the others and a very handsome person. You also, with the matter of the donkeys, need to not miss the positive parts of this. He's actually looking for them. I mean, what did Jesus' parable tell us? Is that the good shepherd looks for the animals that are lost. And so he's out searching for them, trying to find them. And what's more, they're not just his donkeys, they're his father's donkeys. And his father's lost them and said, go find them. And Saul says, okay, I will. And we've learned in 1 Samuel that oftentimes whether or not the sons obey the father is an indication of the type of leader they will become. And so here's some positive elements, even in this portrayal of Saul looking for the donkeys. And as they're looking, though, they sort of realize, man, like this search party is not succeeding. And my dad's going to start worrying about me. And so he says to his crew and his servant in particular, let's just head back. And the servant says, there's a prophet nearby. Let's go visit him and see if he can help us. And so they go and they have dinner with this character who turns out to be Samuel. This is in chapters 9 and 10. And even here you have a positive and a combination of the negative and positive elements. Negatively, Samuel was unknown to Saul. Saul didn't know that there was a prophet here. Why? We don't know. Also, Saul's response, first of all, is, I don't have any money to pay for this meal. Like, we just don't have the resources. And the servant says, it's okay, I got it. So negatively, Saul doesn't have what is needed for this mission. But positively, he says, okay, let's go. He's willing to listen to anyone. Let's go talk to a prophet. I'm not opposed to this. That's a really positive thing. And they go, and long story short, they have dinner with Samuel, who's been told ahead of time by God, this is the person who I want you to appoint as Israel's first king. And long story short, Saul is told by Samuel, you're going to be the king. And he's pretty surprised by this because he's not a very prominent person in his family and not a very prominent family in the tribe, not a very prominent tribe in the people. And yet this is the announcement that Samuel brings. And he says to him, I want you to leave this place, and I want you to, he names these 3 cities, and here's what's going to happen. And all of these things happen just as Samuel said they would happen. And so we're seeing that there's some confirmation here that he's a certain type of leader, and this is an important detail for later. At the very end of this, he actually says to him, hey, I want you to go to Gilgal on a particular time and place. You'll know when the time has come, and I want you to wait for me. I'll actually read this portion from chapter 10. he says to him in chapter 10, verse 8, "Go down ahead of me into Gilgal. I will surely come down to you to sacrifice burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, but you must wait 7 days until I come to you and tell you what you are to do." So there's this future event that we don't really know what it's going to be, but we'll find out as we proceed. Well, dinner's over, and the next thing that happens is actually the introduction. In some ways, it's the crowning of Saul as the king. And again, it's a very fascinating scene that we come across still there in chapter 10, because they go through this ceremony to identify the tribe and the clan and the family and the person, and it turns out Saul's going to be the king, but he's looking around and he's not there. It's because he's hiding with the equipment. Well, what do we make of this? Is this positive or is this negative? It's kind of hard to know. At some level, it's not super good. Kind of looks like he's a scaredy cat. I suppose you could make a case that perhaps this is an indication of his humility. He's not interested in leading the people. He just wants to go about his business. And maybe that's the type of leader that you want to be in charge, the one who's not driven by ego and a desire for power. And at any rate, he's identified, he's brought out, and there in chapter 10, Samuel reads him the rights and responsibilities of the kingship, and he is at that particular point introduced publicly as the king. Well, we wonder where things are going to go from there, again, because we have this combination of positive and negative, but I'll go ahead and tip my hat by labeling the next story in this particular narrative victory. I mean, it's a really cool event that happens in 1 Samuel chapter 11, you have this enemy of Israel, Nahash the Ammonite, who'd been threatening them for a while. It says he went up and he besieged Jabesh Gilead. That's an important city in Israel's history. Read the book of Judges for a bit of context on this. And all the men of Jabesh said to him, "Make a treaty with us and we'll be subject to you." So here you have some Israelites who are in danger of becoming subject to this pagan king. But Nahash the Ammonite replies, "I will make a treaty with you only on the condition that I gouge out the right eye of every one of you, and so bring disgrace on all Israel." This is an attack on Israel and her God because he's disgracing some portion of the people. The elders of Jabesh said to him, "Give us 7 days so we can send messengers throughout Israel. If no one comes to rescue us, we'll surrender to you." When the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and reported these terms to the people, they wept aloud. Just then Saul was returning from the fields behind his oxen, and he asked, "What is wrong with everyone? Why are they weeping?" And then they repeated to him what the men of Jabesh had said. When Saul heard their words, the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and he burned with anger. He took a pair of oxen, cut them into pieces, and sent them pieces by messengers throughout Israel, proclaiming, "This is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel." Then the terror of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out together as one. When Saul mustered them at Bezek, the men of Israel numbered 300,000, and those of Judah 30,000. They told the messengers who had come, "Say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, by the time the sun is hot tomorrow, you will be rescued." When the messengers went and reported this to the men of Jabesh, they were elated. I bet they were. They said to the Ammonites, "Tomorrow we'll surrender to you, and you can do to us whatever you like." Well, the next day Saul separated his men into 3 divisions. During the last watch of the night, they broke into the camp of the Ammonites and slaughtered them until the heat of the day. Those who survived were scattered, so that no 2 of them were left together. This is indeed a great victory, and it confirms that maybe Saul will be a wonderful king. I mean, this is precisely what we need. This is precisely what we want. This is the kind of leader that God has appointed in the past. Don't miss some of the connections between Saul and Gideon in particular. Gideon, of course, was the famous soldier who took his 300 men up against the thousands upon thousands of Midianite warriors and was victorious. Well, here Saul has more troops, but they are in multiples of 3, and he divides them just like Gideon into 3 divisions and spreads them out, and they win this victory. And so we're wondering, maybe this will be good. And to be honest with you, there's not a lot negative going on here. Saul is moved by the Spirit of the Lord to lead the people. And what's more, even after victory, after this happens, we read a quick report there of some of Saul's men saying, "Now let's go find all the people who weren't excited about you being king and let's kill them." And Saul says, No one will die today on my account. And so not only is he victorious, but he's merciful. Perhaps he is indeed what we hope for. And the fact that he's ready to take charge of the people is indicated by the next story, which is the farewell, not of Saul, but of Samuel. Now that Saul is here and has established his rule, Samuel is prepared to say goodbye, and so he does. And his speech before the people is essentially, "Hey, if anybody knows of something that I've done to wrong someone, you come tell me now, because I believe I've acted with integrity." And the people say, No, you're good. We've appreciated all that you've done. And he says, "Good, and God has been good to you, and he has provided for you, but you've rebelled against him. just like your fathers did. You demanded a king. But then he actually gives them this caveat. This is so great. He says to them, even though you have, in seeing Nahash, you demanded a king to rule over us, even though God was your king and you said you wanted one, and the Lord has set one for you. In chapter 12, verse 14, he says, if you fear the Lord, even after getting the king, if you fear the Lord and serve and obey him and do not rebel against his commands, and if both you and the king who reigns over you follow the Lord your God, good. He's saying good. You have some checkered, ugly seasons in your past history, but the future can be bright. Of course, comes with a warning, but if you do not obey the Lord and if you rebel against his commands, his hand will be against you as it was against your ancestors. And so Samuel bids farewell to the people after praying for them to continue to follow after God. And we're left to wonder, now that Saul is in charge and his rule is here, what will the title of the next chapter be? And it's incredibly unfortunate that we're forced to write the word disobedience, because that's precisely what we see in chapter 13. We come now to the scene that Samuel had talked about when he said to Saul, when he said to Saul, I want you to wait 7 days. You got 2 signs. It's time to offer the sacrifice. 7 days have passed, and I arrive and tell you what to do next. Until this happens, I don't want you to do anything. Well, Samuel was a bit scared. He had quite a few soldiers with him, and then his son actually started a fight with the Philistines, and so this news is going out. Saul has attacked the Philistines, and Israel's become obnoxious to them, and all the people join Saul. Let's pick up the chapter in 13, verse 5. It says, the Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They went up and camped at Michmash, east of Bethaven. When the Israelites saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard pressed, they hid in caves and thickets, among the rocks and in pits and cisterns. This is not good. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. They're on the run. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. He's waiting. It says he waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. Remember, 2 signs, 7 days, and I'll arrive. Then you'll know what to do. Saul is getting afraid, and I would too, to be honest with you. So would you. And so what does he do? He acts. He says in verse 9, bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings. And Saul offered up the burnt offering. And just as he finished making the offering, still on that 7th day, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him. What have you done? Asked Samuel. And Saul replied, look, when I saw that the men were scattering, and that you did not come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I've not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. Notice the blame. I noticed that the men were afraid, and you weren't here, and the Philistines were coming, and so I acted against my own better judgment. But I did this because I didn't know what else to do. I felt compelled to do, well, precisely what you told me not to do. And so Samuel says in verse 13, you've done a foolish thing. You've not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, you would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command. Then Samuel left Gilgal and went up to Gibeah and Benjamin, and Saul counted the men who were with him. They numbered about 600. Though the Spirit has enabled Saul to reach real heights, let's not underestimate the value of what Saul was able to accomplish in his early days in the kingdom. Though he has been enabled by the Spirit of God to accomplish great victories, he is in the end crippled by his fear, mirroring the sin of the Israelites who demanded a king right now and refused to wait. And so in mirroring their sin with his impatient refusal to trust and wait, he actually becomes precisely the king they ask for, one like the other nations. This is indeed the story of the rise and fall of the first King Saul, and there's much to learn. Perhaps we could draw a few observations for us. For one thing, when we look at the people of Israel, we do well to remind that common bit of tradition and wisdom that's probably not a bad idea to indeed remember. Be careful what you ask for. In this case, be careful what you ask for, because God might, in fact, give it to you. There's some intentional wordplay with the idea of asking in this story. Remember, Hannah asked for Samuel, a child she would devote to the Lord, and the Lord gave her Samuel. And she said, I named him Samuel because I asked of the Lord, and he gave me. It's a strange statement because Samuel doesn't actually mean heard. What does mean heard, or is more like the Hebrew word for to hear, or to ask rather, is the word Saul. That means ask. And so Israel asks for Saul, whereas Hannah asked for Samuel. And so you see in this contrast that whereas we hoped that Hannah would become a model for Israel, Israel actually does not follow in the footsteps of her mother Hannah. And she asks not for what God would provide, so that it might be devoted back to him, but for what we demand right here and now. Anyway, the point is, be careful what you ask for, because God might give it to you. A second observation that we might draw from this text, and this works in multiple directions. The general truth would be that stories do not end where they begin. They don't. They continue and they take turns, and sometimes it's an open question from our vantage point, what type of turns the story will take. On the one hand, failure does not guarantee more failure. Samuel told the people, you rejected God, but if you fear and serve him now, it is going to go well with you. Failure doesn't have to be the last word. But at the same time, success does not guarantee more success. Saul, it was ambiguous for a bit, and his first public action was really, really strong. But this first public action does not guarantee what's coming next. And so we recognize that just as failure doesn't guarantee more failure, success doesn't guarantee more success. And so if you yourself are not in a good place, if you're doing poorly, be encouraged because your story is not over. And if you are in a good place, if you're doing well and you're walking with the Lord, then be warned because your story is not over. And the stories don't always end where they begin. A third thing that we could probably draw, and we need to say something about obedience because it's such a critical component of this story. Perhaps we could say it like this: what matters is not what you've done in the past, but whether you will obey right now. That's a truth that I don't even want to say it emerges from the text. It almost jumps up and slaps us on the face, and it's a weird situation because it sort of looks like Saul was, had legitimate reasons to do what he did, and yet it also seems from the vantage point of readers, we can see that Saul was being tested, and the question was, will he wait on the Lord's timing and obey the word he received from Samuel? And in fact, he doesn't. And the question is not whether God's plan will endure. I don't even think at this point the question is whether or not Saul has a place in God's family, but the question at this point is, will Samuel fulfill the role that was written for him? Same thing's true for us. The question is not whether God's plan will endure or whether God will still accept and forgive us in spite of the fact that we've not always done the right thing. The question is, will we fulfill the role for which we have written? Will we receive the blessing that God wants to not only give to us, but he wants us to steward for the sake of others? And indeed, the Spirit, just like with Saul, the Spirit is the one who makes us new and leads us forward, but we bear real responsibility to continue along the path of obedience. It's like Galatians 5 says, since we live by the Spirit, let's keep in step with the Spirit. And the final word may seem somewhat anticlimactic, but I really think it's very important for understanding how this passage fits into the larger scope of God's revelation in the Old Testament and, of course, in the New. What we see in this passage is that royal power or kingly power is subservient to the prophetic word. In most cultures and societies, those with the political power are the ones who run the show. Well, this is not most societies. This is a central observation to Israelite faith. The prophetic word trumps kingly power. You see this in multiple places. You see this ritually whenever Samuel reads the rights and responsibilities of the king. I'm going to tell you what you're supposed to do. And you might think this is mere formality, but the end of the story confirms for us, no, this is not the mere formality at all, that God actually spoke to the king through the prophet, and the king was responsible to listen to the prophet, not the other way around. Again, this is a central aspect of Israelite faith, and it endures in the church. We as the church, we as the people of God are ruled by God, and the present embodiment of his rule here and now in our day comes not in the form of a president or a pope, but a book which we read and from which we preach. If you want to know the will of the one you call king, then go to church and hear the word. And that doesn't satisfy you, then search it out for yourself. And when you do hear a word addressed to you through the word, here's the thing, the prophetic word is alive and it comes through the word to us via the Spirit. And when you do hear this, last thought, hear this well, the question for you and the question for me is not what we've done up to that point. It is whether we will obey right now.